Hi, my name's Kristen, and today on my video, I'm going to talk to you about the power of looking, and specifically the scopophilic images that we were talking about in class earlier. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a huge fan of Britney Spears, and I've never owned her perfume, but during our discussion of scopophilia and voyeurism, I couldn't help but to think that her Curious commercial was a great example of what we were talking about. So let's take a look and then we can discuss it. Okay, so now we just saw the video and we can discuss it. In this perfume commercial, we see Britney and a handsome male walking simultaneously back to their hotel rooms. And I noticed that just for one instant that they make eye contact with each other, but it's only for a moment, as if they don't want the other person to catch them in the act of looking at them or fantasizing about them or having the voyeuristic desires that we've discussed. Now, after they have that little glance, they run right back into their hotel rooms because they don't want to be caught. And Britney goes into her room and sits down and has a fantasy about the man. And right before she has this fantasy, the director has her face blurred in and out and blurred in and out of focus. And I think that's because it's uncomfortable for us to see her inner head and her desires. So they blur her face maybe because they don't want us to reveal her fantasy. And even in the fantasy, they go through images and they don't show a fantasy, front to back like a storyline. They just show flashes of images like lightning or rolling around to the beach or hooking up. And I think that's because, like we've discussed, when we see things, we don't really see a full image. We notice a leg or an arm or a bead of sweat. And so I think it's interesting that that's also the way that they presented those images in the commercial. Although these images are still in the imaginary stages in Britney's mind, they still have a command over her, which I think is interesting. At the end of the commercial, it asks, "Do you dare?" And usually a dare is typically something that you normally wouldn't do. That's, why it's called a dare. And so I think that this fetishic voyeurism that Britney has, she's kind of daring herself to go for it, but she can't quite get up the nerves to do it. So Britney's fantasy has the power to motivate her to almost do something that's out of her character. Looking is a kind of pleasure, but it's also a kind of power. If these two, the boys and Britney, if they wanted to, if they were just working on their ids, their inner animals, they would open the doors and hook up with each other, but they're restrained by their super egos that aren't allowing them to fulfill these unfettered desires that are right behind the door. And here is another great example that we've talked about in class. The door that's right in between them, I think, really lends itself to voyeurism and to scopophilia, because if, they could just act on their ids, they would open the door and fulfill their fantasies. But that door between them is just, the tension that I think that voyeurism has a lot of the time. So finally, at the end of the commercial, it shows the perfume, and its name is Curious. And I think the word curious for the perfume in general is a good example of what voyeurism is and what scopophilia is. Sure, we look things to receive pleasure, but we also look at things out of curiosity. And these objects that we curiously look at have a unique power to intrigue and captivate us, often against our own will and consciousness, which I think is a really interesting point.